The first time Thomas Blackwood saw the map, he was standing in a candlelit room above a tavern in Port Royal, watching a dying man trace a trembling finger across faded parchment that showed an island that shouldn't exist. The old sailor, a Portuguese named Costa who had sailed with some of the last of the buccaneers, coughed blood onto the already stained document, his eyes fever bright as he whispered about gold beyond imagining about a Spanish treasure fleet that had vanished in a hurricane 70 years earlier, about a light that shone from beneath the waves on certain nights when the moon was dark. Thomas had heard 1,000 such tales in his years, working the Caribbean trade routes, stories told by drunks and dreamers, and men driven mad by sun and salt. But something about this map, about the specificity of Costa's coordinates, about the way the old man clutched his arm with desperate strength before dying, made Thomas believe that perhaps just this once, the impossible tale might be true. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and, if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thomas Blackwood was 32 years old in the autumn of 1726, and he had spent nearly half his life at sea. He was the second son of a modest English merchant family, destined by birth order for the Navy or the Church, neither of which had appealed to his restless temperament. Instead, he had run away to sea at 16, working his way up from cabin boy to mate on merchant vessels that plied the Atlantic trade routes. He had seen Boston and Kingston, Havana and Cartagena, had weathered hurricanes and fought off pirates, had learned to navigate by stars and currents and the subtle signs that experienced sailors read in the color of the water and the behavior of seabirds. He was a capable sailor but not an exceptional one, a competent navigator but not a master, a decent fighter but not a warrior. What distinguished him was his persistence, his ability to see projects through to completion even when circumstances made abandonment seem like the wiser choice. It was this quality that had made him valuable to various captains over the years, and it was this quality that would drive his pursuit of the treasure that Costa's map promised. The map itself was a remarkable document, though its authenticity was impossible to verify. It was drawn on vellum that had been treated to resist water, though age and handling had left it stained and fragile at the edges. The cartography was crude, but oddly precise, showing the familiar outlines of Cuba and Jamaica and Hispaniola, but also marking a small island roughly 150 miles north of the Cuban coast that appeared on no other map Thomas had ever seen. The island was marked with a symbol that might have been a cross, or might have been something else. The ink had faded and blurred, making interpretation uncertain. Around this symbol were written coordinates in what appeared to be an older Portuguese hand, along with notations in a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish that Thomas could only partially decipher. There were references to gold of the sun, to light beneath the waters, to the fleet of Don Francisco, and to specific landmarks that would supposedly guide a searcher to the treasure's location. Don Francisco de Ribera had been a Spanish admiral commanding a treasure fleet, returning from the New World to Spain in 1656. Historical records indicated that his fleet, carrying several years' worth of gold and silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico, had sailed into a massive hurricane near the Bahama Channel and had never been seen again. It was assumed that all ships had sunk with their cargo, and the Spanish crown had sent several expeditions to try to locate and salvage the treasure, but without success. Eventually, the loss had been written off, becoming one of many maritime disasters that littered the floor of the Caribbean. But Costa had claimed to know where the fleet had actually gone, or at least where one ship from the fleet had ended up. According to his fever-rambling story, his father had been part of a salvage crew in the late 17th century that had discovered wreckage near an uncharted island. They had found gold, Costa insisted, more gold than they could carry. But before they could mount a proper salvage operation, they had been attacked by Spanish authorities who were still trying to protect their claim to the treasure. Most of the salvage crew had been killed or captured. Costa's father had escaped with only the map and the memory of what he had seen. It was the kind of story that every treasure hunter wanted to believe, and that most rational people dismissed as fantasy. The Caribbean was full of such tales, each one promising untold riches that somehow remained perpetually just out of reach. Men had spent fortunes and sacrificed years chasing shadows and rumors, only to find nothing but disappointment and bankruptcy. But Thomas, studying the map by candlelight after Costa had died and been unceremoniously removed by the tavern keeper, felt a conviction growing that this might be different. The coordinates were specific. The landmarks were detailed enough that they could potentially be verified. And there was something about the physical map itself, the quality of the materials, the style of the cartography, the specific references to navigation points, that suggested it had been created by someone who actually knew these waters, who had actually been to this place, rather than by someone simply fabricating a fantasy. The immediate problem was that Thomas had no ship, no crew, and limited funds. He was currently working as first mate on a merchant brig called the Providence, running cargo between Port Royal and various settlements along the Central American coast. It was steady work but not lucrative, and he had managed to save only a modest amount from his wages, certainly not enough to finance a treasure hunting expedition. He needed partners, people with resources and skills, who could be convinced to invest in what was admittedly a speculative venture. He spent the next several days discreetly making inquiries, feeling out potential collaborators, trying to gauge who might be both capable and trustworthy, a difficult combination to find in the rough maritime community of Port Royal. The first person he approached was Sarah Merchant, and this required considerable thought and no small amount of courage. Sarah was unusual in almost every respect. She was a woman operating independently in a world dominated by men, running a small shipping business she had inherited from her father 5 years earlier, when she was only 23. She had kept the business afloat despite considerable obstacles and opposition, proving herself to be shrewd, capable, and utterly fearless in negotiating the complex commercial and social landscapes of Caribbean trade. Thomas had met her several years earlier, when the Providence had carried cargo for her company. They had developed a relationship that was somewhere between professional respect and friendship, marked by long conversations about navigation and commerce, and the peculiar challenges of making one's way in a world that didn't quite have a place for people like them. Him, the restless second son. Her, the woman who refused to conform to expected roles. He found her at her small office near the harbor, reviewing shipping manifests and correspondence. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine warmth when she recognized him. "Thomas, I heard you were in port. The Providence is scheduled to sail in 2 days, isn't it?" She gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her desk, which was cluttered with the organized chaos of an active business. "That was the plan," Thomas said, "but something has come up and I'm considering other options." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. She had known him long enough to read the significance of his careful phrasing. "Other options that involve treasure hunting by any chance?" "You have that look. The one men get when they've heard a story that's almost certainly nonsense but that they've convinced themselves might be real." Thomas laughed despite himself. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows you well enough to recognize when you're wrestling with whether to be sensible or to chase something impossible." Sarah set down her pen and gave him her full attention. "Tell me about it." He spread the map on her desk, explaining Costa's story and his own assessment of the document's potential authenticity. Sarah listened without interruption, her sharp mind clearly evaluating the information he was providing. When he finished, she studied the map in silence for several minutes, her fingers tracing the marked coordinates, her eyes narrowing as she worked through calculations. "It's an interesting proposition," she said finally. "The location is plausible. There are shoals and reefs in that area that could conceal a small island, particularly one that's low-lying and doesn't show up well from typical shipping lanes. The references to Don Francisco's fleet are historically accurate. And this map," she paused, examining the parchment more closely. "This is genuine 17th century work, or an extremely good forgery. The materials, the ink, the style, they're all consistent with that period." "So you think it might be real?" Thomas tried to keep the eagerness out of his voice. I think it might not be complete nonsense, which is not the same thing, Sarah replied. Even if the map is genuine, even if there really was a shipwreck at this location, that doesn't mean the treasure is still there, or that we could recover it if it were. 70 years is a long time. Other salvagers could have found it. The wreckage could be buried under sand or coral. The gold could have been scattered across miles of ocean floor by currents. She paused, then smiled slightly. But it's interesting enough that I'm willing to discuss possibilities. They talked for hours, working through logistics and costs, identifying what would be needed for an expedition that had any real chance of success. A ship, obviously, but not a large one, something nimble that could navigate shallow waters and reefs. A crew, but small and trustworthy, since the more people who knew about the treasure, the greater the risk of betrayal or competition. Equipment for salvage work, including weighted lines, grappling hooks, possibly diving bells or weighted platforms that would allow someone to work underwater for brief periods. Provisions for an extended voyage, since they didn't know how long the search might take. And capital to fund all of this, since neither of them had sufficient resources individually. I might be able to secure a ship, Sarah said thoughtfully. There's a sloop in the harbor that's being sold by an estate. The owner died without heirs, and his creditors are liquidating assets. It's sound but needs some work. I could probably acquire it for a reasonable price, especially if I offer cash. And I could assemble a crew, Thomas offered. I know men who are capable and relatively discreet, who might be willing to sign on for shares of whatever we find, rather than straight wages. Which brings us to the fundamental question, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. How do we structure this arrangement? How do we split costs and potential profits? What happens if we find nothing, or if we find something but can't recover it? What happens if we find treasure but can't agree on how to dispose of it? These were practical questions that Thomas had been avoiding thinking about too directly. But Sarah was right to raise them. Treasure hunting ventures had a notorious tendency to end badly, with partners falling into disputes or betraying each other, with success turning into disaster through poor planning or simple greed. If they were going to do this, they needed clear agreements and mutual trust. They negotiated terms over the next several days, eventually settling on a partnership structure that seemed fair to both of them. Sarah would provide the ship and cover most of the upfront costs, giving her a larger share of any treasure recovered. Thomas would captain the expedition, recruit and manage the crew, and handle the navigation and salvage work, earning his share through labor and expertise. Any treasure found would be divided into shares, 3 for Sarah, 2 for Thomas, and the remainder split among the crew based on their roles and the length of their service. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was clear and mutually acceptable, and they formalized it with a written contract that Sarah drafted with careful legal precision. The contract also included provisions for what would happen in various contingency scenarios. If one of them died if they found nothing, if they were attacked, or the ship was lost if Spanish or British authorities tried to claim the treasure. Sarah had a lawyer's mind, despite no formal legal training, and Thomas was grateful for her thoroughness, even as he chafed slightly at the time it took to work through every possible scenario. With the partnership established, they moved to implementation. Sarah negotiated the purchase of the sloop, a vessel called the Pelican that was about 60 feet long, shallow drafted and built for speed rather than cargo capacity. It was perfect for their purposes, though it did need repairs and modifications. They hired carpenters to reinforce the hull and deck, to build a reinforced capstan that could handle heavy salvage work, to create secure storage compartments for any treasure they might recover. Thomas began recruiting crew members, a delicate process that required finding men who were skilled but also willing to work for shares, rather than guaranteed wages, who were capable of discretion, but not so disconnected from normal society that they couldn't be trusted. He started with people he had sailed with before, men whose character he knew and whose abilities he respected. The first recruit was James Patterson, a Scottish sailor about Thomas's age who had spent years working Caribbean waters. James was steady and skilled, particularly good at reading weather patterns and managing rigging in difficult conditions. He agreed to serve as first mate, taking the second largest crew share in exchange for his expertise and responsibilities. Next came Miguel Santos, a mixed-race freedman who had been born in Barbados and had worked as a diver recovering cargo from ships that had run aground or foundered in shallow water. Miguel could hold his breath for astonishing lengths of time and was comfortable working underwater in ways that would terrify most sailors. His skills would be essential if they actually found wreckage that needed to be explored or salvaged. They recruited 6 more men to serve as crew, experienced sailors all, men who could handle the normal work of running a ship, but who also brought various specialized skills that might prove useful. There was Benjamin, a former ship's carpenter who could make repairs at sea. There was Jack, who had worked as a gunner and could handle the 4 small cannon they mounted on the Pelican for self-defense. There was Antonio, a Portuguese navigator who had sailed with several survey expeditions and who had expertise in coastal cartography. The others were general crew, capable and trustworthy, selected as much for their character as their technical skills. Sarah did not sail with them initially, though she spent considerable time aboard the Pelican during its preparation, learning the ship's characteristics, meeting the crew, ensuring that the salvage equipment was properly secured and that the ship was stocked with adequate provisions. She was skeptical that the crew would accept her authority if she came aboard in any official capacity. And Thomas had to admit she was probably right. The maritime world was slowly becoming more accepting of women in certain roles, but a woman as joint commander of a treasure hunting expedition would strain credibility and potentially cause problems with a crew that needed to function smoothly under potentially dangerous conditions. They did agree, however, that Sarah would join them once they reached the search area, coming out on a smaller vessel that would rendezvous with the Pelican. She wanted to be present for the actual search and any salvage work, both to protect her investment and because she was genuinely fascinated by the prospect of discovering something that had been lost for 70 years. The Pelican sailed from Port Royal on a bright morning in early December, catching a favorable wind that carried them northeast along the Cuban coast. The ship handled well, responsive and quick, exactly what they needed for the kind of careful navigation that reef-filled waters would require. The crew was professional and efficient, settling into routines quickly, and Thomas felt a cautious optimism that perhaps this venture might actually succeed. The first challenge was simply finding the island that the map indicated. The coordinates were specific, but 18th century navigation was an imprecise art, dependent on celestial observations that could be affected by clouds or haze, on dead reckoning that accumulated errors over distance, on landmarks that might have changed or that might have been incorrectly identified in the first place. Antonio worked carefully with sextant and compass, checking and rechecking their position, but even he admitted considerable uncertainty about their exact location as they approached the area marked on Costa's map. They arrived at the approximate coordinates on their 4th day out from Port Royal, in the late afternoon when the sun was lowering toward the western horizon. The area appeared to be empty ocean, deep blue water with no visible land or even shallow reefs that would suggest hidden islands. Thomas felt disappointment settling in his stomach, the familiar letdown that accompanied the discovery that a promising lead was apparently false. "This is the location," Antonio said, double-checking his calculations. "According to the coordinates on the map, we should be within a mile of the marked position, but there's nothing here." "The map could be wrong," James said pragmatically, "or the island could have been destroyed by storms in the past 70 years. Hurricane waves can reshape entire coastlines, and small islands are particularly vulnerable." They spent the rest of the daylight hours sailing in expanding circles around the coordinates, looking for any sign of land or shallow water. They found nothing. As darkness fell, Thomas ordered them to heave to wait through the night and resume the search at dawn. The crew was disappointed but not yet discouraged. They had signed on knowing this was speculative, knowing that success would require both skill and considerable luck. Thomas stood at the rail long after the rest of the crew had settled in for the night, watching moonlight reflect off the gentle swells, thinking about Costa's last words about light beneath the waters. He had assumed that was fever-induced rambling, but now he wondered if it might have been more literal, if the island had sunk or been submerged, If the treasure was in shallow water, might there be some kind of visual marker? He was about to dismiss the idea as wishful thinking when he saw it. A faint luminescence in the water perhaps half a mile to the north. A subtle glow that could have been bioluminescent plankton disturbed by current or fish movement. But that seemed somehow different, more localized and persistent than the usual ocean phosphorescence. "James," he called quietly, not wanting to wake the whole crew with what might be nothing. "Come look at this." The first mate joined him at the rail, following Thomas's pointing finger toward the faint glow. They watched in silence for several minutes. "Could be anything," James said finally. "Phosphorescence, as you're probably thinking, or fish feeding on something, or our eyes playing tricks in the dark." "Could be," Thomas agreed. "But should we check it out?" They lowered a boat and rowed toward the glow, bringing a lantern but keeping it hooded so their eyes could adjust to the darkness. As they approached, the luminescence became more distinct, not bright but definite, a pale greenish glow emanating from underwater, maybe 15 or 20 feet down, based on how diffuse it appeared from the surface. What would cause that? Thomas wondered aloud. "Don't know," James admitted, "but I don't like it. Could be something natural, could be something dangerous. There are stories about glows in the water that mark graves or cursed places." Thomas was not particularly superstitious, but he had to admit that the glowing water was unsettling in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It was too regular, too persistent, too localized to seem entirely natural. But whether supernatural or not, it matched Costa's description of light beneath the waters, and that seemed like too significant a coincidence to ignore. They returned to the Pelican and woke Miguel, explaining what they had found. The diver was intrigued rather than frightened. "I'll go down in the morning," he said, "when there's enough light to see properly. If there's something there, I'll find it." Dawn came with clear skies and calm seas, ideal conditions for underwater work. They positioned the Pelican above the glow, which was barely visible in daylight but still detectably present as a subtle distortion in the water. Miguel prepared himself carefully, stripping to minimal clothing, coating his skin with oil to help maintain body heat, securing a weighted belt that would help him descend, and a knife in case he needed to cut himself free from entanglement. They attached a line to him that he could tug to signal when he wanted to be pulled up, and made sure someone was constantly holding the other end, ready to haul him to safety if necessary. Then Miguel took several deep breaths, hyperventilating to saturate his blood with oxygen, and dove. He was under for perhaps 90 seconds on that first dive, resurfacing with an expression of astonishment. "There's structure down there," he gasped, catching his breath. "Coral-covered, but definitely man-made. Looks like it might be part of a ship, but it's broken up and scattered. And there's something..." He paused, clearly struggling to find words. "Something that glows, like phosphorescent wood or paint. It's marking the wreckage, making it visible even in low light." Over the next several hours, Miguel made multiple dives, gradually mapping what lay beneath them. It was indeed a wreck, substantial timbers and structure suggesting a large ship, though so overgrown with coral and so broken up by waves and time that its original form was difficult to discern. The glowing material appeared to be some kind of organic growth, or possibly a chemical residue from the ship's cargo, something that retained light and released it slowly, creating the subtle illumination they had observed. And there was gold. Not the massive piles that treasure stories promised, but definite evidence of precious metal. Coins scattered among the coral, what looked like a partially intact strongbox wedged in rocks. Various metal objects that might be valuable or might be worthless depending on their composition and condition. The discovery energized the entire crew. They set to work immediately, rigging tackle and lines, preparing Miguel for extended salvage operations, organizing a system for safely bringing recovered items to the surface. Thomas sent a boat back toward Cuba with a message for Sarah, telling her they had found wreckage that matched the map's description and asking her to come as quickly as possible with any additional supplies or equipment she thought might be useful. The salvage work was grueling and dangerous, Miguel could only work in short bursts, limited by how long he could hold his breath and by the physical exhaustion of diving repeatedly to depths of 15 to 20 feet. They tried using a diving bell, essentially an inverted barrel weighted and lowered to the wreck site, which did allow somewhat longer work periods by trapping air that Miguel could breathe while underwater, but it was cumbersome and difficult to position accurately in the current. The wreck was also treacherous, full of sharp edges and unstable structures that could shift unexpectedly. Miguel cut himself numerous times on coral or metal, and there was constant danger of entanglement or being trapped beneath falling debris. They established strict safety protocols, with 2 crew members always watching and ready to pull Miguel up immediately if he signaled distress. But everyone understood that they were engaged in inherently dangerous work. What they brought up was tantalizing but frustrating. Coins, yes, scattered in quantities that suggested there had once been much more, that was now lost or buried too deeply to reach. Some jewelry, gold chains, a ruby ring, what looked like a silver crucifix, various ship fittings and tools, interesting for what they might reveal about the vessel but not valuable in themselves. And slowly, with enormous effort, pieces of what appeared to be more substantial treasure, ingots of silver, a small chest containing gold coins that spilled out as they raised it through the water, what looked like religious items possibly intended for a church or cathedral in the New World. After 2 weeks of intensive work, they had accumulated perhaps 400 pounds of gold and silver in various forms, plus assorted other items of uncertain value. It was a substantial haul, worth enough to make everyone involved significantly wealthier, but it was also clearly only a fraction of what Don Francisco's treasure fleet would have been carrying. Either this had been a smaller ship with less cargo, or most of the treasure was still down there, buried or dispersed in ways they couldn't access with their current equipment and techniques. Sarah arrived during the 3rd week, bringing additional supplies and 2 more crew members who had diving experience. She was fascinated by everything: the wreck site, the salvage operation, the artifacts they had recovered. She spent hours examining the coins and other items, trying to determine their origin and age, trying to piece together what had actually happened to this ship. "This is definitely from the 1650s, she said, showing Thomas a coin with markings that allowed precise dating. "And these markings," she pointed to symbols on some of the ingots, "these are consistent with Peruvian silver from the Potosi mines. This was almost certainly part of Don Francisco's fleet, or at least a ship from that era carrying similar cargo." "So Costa was telling the truth," Thomas said. "Or at least his father was. There really was treasure here, and it really was from the lost fleet. The question is whether there's more," Sarah said, looking out at the water that concealed whatever remained of the wreck. "Whether what we found is everything accessible, or whether the main cargo is still down there, buried or broken up in ways we haven't discovered yet." They debated whether to continue or to be satisfied with what they had already recovered. The crew was exhausted, the ship's provisions were running low, and there was the constant worry that someone else might discover what they were doing and either try to claim the treasure legally or simply attack them and take it by force. On the other hand, if there was significantly more treasure still accessible, leaving it behind would be foolish. They compromised by deciding to continue for 1 more week, but to work more strategically, having Miguel focus on areas that seem most likely to conceal substantial cargo, rather than trying to systematically explore the entire wreck site. Sarah also hired local fishermen to bring out fresh provisions and to serve as lookouts, watching for any other vessels that might be taking undue interest in their activities. The targeted approach proved effective. On the 4th day of the final week, Miguel found what he had been hoping for: a section of hull that had broken away but had settled relatively intact on the sea floor, creating a sheltered pocket where heavier items had accumulated. Inside were more strong boxes, more ingots, and several sacks of coins that had been preserved by their container despite decades of submersion. Recovering these items required careful work with ropes and tackle, but over the next 3 days they brought up treasure that tripled what they had previously accumulated. When they finally finished, their total haul included something over 1,200 pounds of gold and silver, plus various other valuable items. Divided according to their agreed shares, it would make Sarah quite wealthy. and would give Thomas enough to buy his own ship and establish himself as an independent trader. The crew's shares, while smaller, would still represent more money than any of them would normally see in several years of ordinary maritime work. But before they could celebrate, they had to get the treasure safely back to Port Royal, which presented its own challenges. The Pelican was now carrying wealth that would attract attention and possibly danger. Pirates were less common in the Caribbean than they had been earlier in the century, but they still existed, and the kind of treasure they were carrying would be almost irresistible temptation to any vessel with sufficient force to take it. They were also vulnerable to seizure by naval vessels from various nations, any of which might claim legal authority over treasure recovered from these waters. They sailed carefully, staying close to the Cuban coast, where they could run for shelter if threatened, keeping watch constantly, running with minimal lights at night to make themselves less visible. Sarah had hired a small escort vessel, basically armed fishermen willing to sail with them in exchange for a bonus payment that added some deterrence to potential attackers. They made it back to Port Royal without incident, slipping into harbor in the early morning and moving quickly to unload the treasure and store it in a secure warehouse that Sarah had arranged. Only then, with the physical treasure secured, did they allow themselves to believe that they had actually succeeded, that Costa's seemingly impossible tale had been essentially true, that they had found and recovered a significant portion of a lost Spanish treasure fleet. The celebration that night was both joyful and complicated. The crew was ecstatic, already making plans for how they would spend their shares. Sarah was satisfied that her investment had paid off handsomely and that she had proven her judgment and capabilities in yet another domain. But Thomas found himself feeling oddly unsettled, as if success had raised more questions than it had answered. Part of what troubled him was the knowledge that they had left treasure behind, that there was almost certainly more in that wreck than they had managed to recover. He found himself thinking about returning, about mounting another, better-equipped expedition, about perfecting techniques that would allow deeper and longer exploration of the site. But he also recognized that this impulse was dangerous, that treasure hunting could become obsessive in ways that destroyed the lives of those who pursued it too single-mindedly. There was also the question of what to do with the treasure they had recovered. The Spanish crown still technically claimed ownership of any treasure from their ships, regardless of how long it had been lost. The British authorities had their own complex regulations about salvage rights and treasure trove. Disposing of the gold and silver in ways that were both legal and profitable required careful navigation of various official and unofficial systems. Sarah took the lead in handling these complications, using her commercial connections and her understanding of colonial bureaucracy to arrange sales and exchanges that converted the physical treasure into more portable forms of wealth while minimizing official scrutiny and taxation. It was delicate work that took months to complete properly, but when finished, each participant received their shares in forms they could actually use: letters of credit, investments in various commercial ventures, some physical currency for immediate needs. Thomas used his share to purchase his own ship, a sturdy merchant brig that he named the Golden Light, in honor of the glowing water that had led them to their discovery. He hired several crew members from the Pelican expedition, including James as his first mate, and began running his own trading routes through the Caribbean. It was satisfying work, being his own captain, making his own decisions, building a business that was his, rather than working for others. But he also couldn't quite leave treasure hunting behind. Over the next several years, he and Sarah mounted 2 more expeditions based on other maps and rumors, though neither produced results comparable to that first discovery. One led to a wreck that had already been thoroughly salvaged. The other led to nothing at all, the map apparently fraudulent or based on misremembered information. But both expeditions taught them valuable lessons about salvage techniques and about distinguishing promising leads from worthless speculation. The Golden Light prospered as a trading vessel, and Thomas found that he was quite good at the commercial side of maritime work, at identifying profitable routes and cargo, at building relationships with merchants in various ports, at managing the complex logistics of Caribbean trade. His reputation grew, both as a capable captain and as someone who had successfully found treasure. which brought him interesting opportunities and also unwelcome attention from people hoping he would lead them to similar success. Sarah's business expanded significantly with the capital from their treasure hunting success. She acquired additional ships, diversified into various commercial activities beyond shipping, became a respected figure in Port Royal's commercial community despite the ongoing prejudices against women in business. She and Thomas maintained their partnership and friendship, occasionally collaborating on ventures, more often simply serving as trusted advisors to each other as they navigated the complexities of their respective enterprises. They talked sometimes about that first expedition, about the glowing water and the scattered wreck, about the remarkable luck and timing that had made their success possible. The story became somewhat legendary in Caribbean maritime circles, embellished and distorted through retellings until the truth was hard to separate from the fiction. Some versions had them recovering millions in treasure. Others had them fighting off pirates or Spanish naval vessels. A few had them discovering not just gold, but ancient artifacts or maps leading to even greater treasures. The reality, Thomas thought, was remarkable enough without embellishment. They had found what people had been seeking for 70 years. They had recovered treasure that was both historically significant and materially valuable. They had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible stories were true, that the legends had foundations in reality, that persistence and skill, and yes, luck could lead to discoveries that seemed to belong in adventure tales rather than ordinary life. But he also understood that their success had been exceptional precisely because it was so rare. For every treasure hunter who found something real, there were hundreds or thousands who found nothing but disappointment and debt. For every genuine map or credible lead, there were countless frauds and fantasies. The golden light they had followed had been real, but most lights that treasure hunters chased were illusions, reflections of their own desires rather than markers of actual wealth. Miguel, the diver whose skills had been essential to their success, continued working with various salvage operations throughout the Caribbean. He became quite prosperous, sought after for any project requiring underwater work, training other divers in the techniques he had developed. He remained friends with Thomas and was always available when Thomas needed diving expertise for salvage work or treasure hunting expeditions. Antonio, the navigator, went on to work for the Spanish colonial government, conducting surveys and creating maps of Caribbean waters that were remarkable for their accuracy and detail. His work with Thomas had helped him refine his techniques and establish a reputation that led to more official and stable employment. The other crew members from the Pelican expedition went their various ways, some continuing in maritime work, others using their shares to establish themselves in different trades, or to return to families they had left behind when they went to sea. The treasure they had found had changed all their lives in one way or another, giving them opportunities and choices they would not otherwise have had. Though not all of those changes were entirely positive. Jack, the gunner, drank himself to death within 2 years, unable to handle the combination of sudden wealth and the relative boredom of ordinary life after the excitement of treasure hunting. Benjamin, the carpenter, was killed in a tavern fight over a card game. Others simply disappeared, moving on to other places and other lives, their fates unknown. But most of them did well, using their shares wisely, building futures that were more secure and comfortable than they had dared to hope before the expedition. The treasure had not solved all their problems or made them effortlessly happy, but it had given them a foundation, a buffer against the precariousness that characterized most people's lives in the 18th century Caribbean. Thomas's relationship with Sarah evolved over the years from partnership to something deeper and more complex. They never married. Sarah valued her independence too much to accept the legal constraints that marriage would impose on a woman. And Thomas respected her position even while sometimes wishing things could be different. But they were deeply connected, trusting each other in ways that went beyond business or friendship, building a life together that existed outside conventional social categories. They had no children of their own, but Sarah informally adopted several orphans from Port Royal, children who had lost their families to disease or accident or violence, and who would otherwise have faced desperate futures. She educated them, taught them various skills, gave them opportunities to develop capabilities that would allow them to build their own lives. It was a kind of legacy, a way of passing forward the opportunities she had received through her own family's legacy and through the success of their treasure hunting ventures. Thomas found himself mentoring younger sailors and captains, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over decades at sea, helping them avoid the mistakes he had made and learn from the successes he had achieved. He wrote a manual on Caribbean navigation that was privately published and circulated among maritime professionals, sharing insights about currents and winds and landmarks that could only come from extensive first-hand experience. He invested in ventures that created jobs and opportunities for sailors and their families, trying to improve conditions in an industry that was notoriously exploitative and dangerous. The Golden Light sailed Caribbean waters for nearly 20 years under Thomas's command, carrying cargo and occasionally pursuing rumors of treasure when they seemed credible. The ship never again found anything comparable to that first discovery, but it was profitable and reliable, and Thomas built a reputation as a captain who treated his crew fairly, who honored his contracts, who could be trusted to deliver cargo safely and on schedule. He still thought about Costa sometimes, about the dying Portuguese sailor whose map had changed his life. Had Costa's father really found the wreck as claimed, or had he acquired the map some other way? Had the map been created specifically to mark the treasure, or had it been repurposed from some other use? These questions were unanswerable now, but they kept the mystery alive, reminding Thomas that even successful treasure hunters rarely knew the complete story of what they found. The wreck site itself remained largely untouched after their initial salvage work. Thomas considered returning to conduct more thorough exploration, but as years passed and he became more established in regular maritime commerce, the attraction of treasure hunting diminished. He had proven what he needed to prove, had achieved what he needed to achieve. The Golden Light had led him to treasure, but more importantly, it had led him to a life that felt meaningful and satisfying in ways that went beyond material wealth. Sarah eventually wrote a book about their expedition, though it was published anonymously and presented as fiction to avoid legal complications. The book was modestly successful, read by those interested in adventure tales and maritime history, though few realized it was based on real events. In the book, Sarah changed names and details, altered the location and some circumstances, but captured something essential about the experience, the mixture of hope and doubt, the physical demands of salvage work, the complex emotions that accompanied discovering something long lost. Thomas read the manuscript before publication and was struck by how Sarah's account differed from his own memories in subtle but significant ways. She emphasized the planning and organization, the careful management of risks, the importance of partnerships and agreements. His memories focused more on the moments of discovery, the physical sensations of sailing and diving, the visceral excitement of finding gold amid the coral and wreckage. Both accounts were true, but they were true to different aspects of the experience, to different perspectives on what had happened and what it meant. As Thomas moved into his 50s and then his 60s, he gradually reduced his time at sea, spending more time managing his business interests from shore, more time with Sarah and the extended household they had created, more time reflecting on the life he had built from that chance encounter with a dying sailor and a mysterious map. The Golden Light eventually passed to a younger captain, one of the orphans Sarah had raised, who renamed it but maintained its reputation for reliability and fair dealing. The treasure they had found was long since dispersed, converted into other forms of wealth, invested in various enterprises, used to build lives and create opportunities. But the story of the discovery persisted, told and retold, in taverns and ships throughout the Caribbean, becoming part of the region's folklore, inspiring other treasure hunters to pursue their own impossible dreams. Some of those hunters succeeded, most failed. A few died in the attempt. Such was the nature of treasure hunting, an activity that promised transformation but delivered disappointment far more often than wealth. Thomas was grateful that his own experience had been exceptional, that the Golden Light had been real rather than illusory. that Costa's deathbed story had contained enough truth to make the search worthwhile, but he also understood that he had been fortunate in ways that went beyond simply finding treasure. He had found a partner in Sarah who shared his vision and complemented his capabilities. He had assembled a crew that was skilled and loyal. He had possessed just enough resources and just enough knowledge to pursue the opportunity when it appeared. And yes, he had been lucky. Lucky in the timing, lucky in the weather, lucky that the wreck was in water shallow enough to access but deep enough that casual passers-by hadn't already found it. Remove any one of these factors and the expedition would likely have failed. Replace Sarah with someone less capable or trustworthy. Replace Miguel with a less skilled diver. Face a hurricane or a hostile Spanish naval vessel. Find the wreck already salvaged or too deep to reach. Any of these would have turned success into failure, would have made the story one of disappointment rather than triumph. This awareness of contingency, of how easily things could have gone differently, made Thomas both grateful for what had been achieved and humble about his role in achieving it. He had not conquered fate or proved himself superior to all the failed treasure hunters who littered Caribbean history. He had simply been in the right place at the right time with the right people and the right combination of skills and resources. That was worth acknowledging and celebrating, but it was not worth boasting about or treating as evidence of special destiny. On quiet evenings, sitting with Sarah on the veranda of the comfortable house they shared overlooking Port Royal Harbor, Thomas would sometimes tell the story of the Golden Light to the younger members of their household. The story of the dying sailor, the mysterious map, the glowing water, the scattered treasure beneath the waves. He tried to tell it honestly, neither exaggerating their success nor minimizing the difficulties and dangers, neither making it seem like destiny nor making it seem like pure chance. We were fortunate, he would conclude, but we also worked hard, planned carefully, trusted each other, and persevered when circumstances were difficult. The treasure was real, but finding it required more than just following a map. It required judgment and skill and cooperation. And even then, we succeeded partly because we were lucky in ways we couldn't control. The younger listeners would ask questions about the wreck, about the diving, about what it felt like to find gold that had been lost for decades. Thomas answered as honestly as he could, trying to convey the reality of the experience without either romanticizing it beyond recognition or stripping it of the genuine excitement and meaning it had carried. Sarah would sometimes add her own perspective, talking about the business side of treasure hunting, about the importance of proper planning and resource management, about the legal and ethical complexities of claiming ownership of found wealth. Her accounts were more sober than Thomas's, more focused on practical considerations, but they were also essential for anyone who might actually consider following in their footsteps. Don't do it unless you're prepared to lose everything you invest, she would advise. Treasure hunting is speculation at best, gambling at worst. If you have better options for using your time and resources, pursue those options. Only chase treasure if you're in a position where you can afford to fail, and only if you can do it in ways that don't destroy relationships or compromise your integrity. It was good advice, the kind that came from experience rather than theory, from having seen what treasure hunting could do to people who pursued it without adequate preparation or realistic expectations. Thomas knew many men who had been ruined by treasure fever, who had invested everything in ventures that produced nothing, who had sacrificed families and careers chasing dreams that never materialized. That he and Sarah had avoided that fate was due as much to their temperamental caution as to their good fortune in finding actual treasure. As the years passed and Thomas moved deeper into old age, the story of the Golden Light took on the quality of legend even in his own mind. Had it really happened the way he remembered? Had the water really glowed, or had he imposed that detail retrospectively, influenced by Costa's dying words? Had the treasure been as abundant as he recalled, or had memory inflated quantities through repeated recollection? He had physical evidence, coins and artifacts he had kept as souvenirs, documents recording the sale and distribution of the recovered gold and silver. But even physical evidence could be interpreted in various ways, fitted into different narratives. What he was certain of was that the experience had shaped his life in fundamental ways, had given him opportunities and connections that would not have existed otherwise, had taught him lessons about risk and trust and persistence that had served him well in all his subsequent endeavors. Whether the specific details were precisely accurate mattered less than the larger truth of what had happened, that he had taken a chance on an impossible story, had found it to be essentially true, and had built a life on the foundation that discovery provided. Miguel visited occasionally, the old diver now retired but still vigorous, still carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had done extraordinary things. They would sit together and remember the expedition, filling in details each other had forgotten, laughing about mistakes and close calls, marveling at how young they had been, how naive in some ways, how fortunate in their success. "Do you ever think about what else might be down there?" Miguel asked during one such visit. "All the treasure we left behind, all the wreckage we didn't explore?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted, "but I'm too old now to dive on wrecks, and I'm not sure I could muster the energy for another expedition even if I wanted to. Besides, we found enough, more than enough. Trying to get everything would have been greedy and probably would have ended badly." "True," Miguel agreed, "though I still wonder. What if there were chests full of emeralds or pieces of church treasure made of solid gold? What if the main cargo hold was somewhere we never found, buried under sand or coral?" "Then someone else will find it eventually," Thomas said. "Or it will stay lost. Either way, it's not our concern anymore. We got our share and that's enough." They sat in comfortable silence, two old men remembering their youth, their adventure, their moment of extraordinary success in lives that had been mostly ordinary. The golden light had long since faded, if it had ever really existed as they remembered it. But its effects persisted, rippling forward through time, shaping lives and stories, inspiring others to pursue their own impossible dreams. Sarah died first, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 74, surrounded by the family she had built from orphans and strays and people she had chosen to include in her life. Thomas grieved deeply, feeling the loss of his closest friend and most trusted partner, the person who had shared his greatest adventure and had helped him build everything that followed. He organized a memorial service that drew people from throughout the Caribbean, testimonies to Sarah's remarkable life, her achievements, her generosity and vision. Among her possessions, Thomas found a journal she had kept during their treasure hunting expedition, detailed daily accounts of their preparations, their voyage, their discovery and salvage work. Reading it was both painful and comforting, seeing events through her eyes, understanding aspects of the experience he had not fully appreciated at the time, feeling her presence in the careful observations and dry wit that characterized her writing. He also found a letter she had written to him, to be delivered after her death. In it, she thanked him for their partnership, for trusting her with opportunities that most men would never have offered to a woman, for respecting her capabilities and her independence. She wrote about how their treasure hunting success had given her the resources and credibility to build a business and a life that would have been impossible otherwise. How it had validated her belief that women could succeed in domains traditionally reserved for men if only they were given the chance. "The golden light led us to gold," she wrote, "but more importantly, it led us to each other, to a partnership that enriched both our lives in ways that went far beyond material wealth. That treasure, the treasure of genuine friendship and mutual respect and shared adventure, that is what I value most from our expedition, and that is what I will carry with me wherever I go next." Thomas kept that letter, rereading it often in the years that followed, drawing comfort from her words, feeling her continued presence through the written expression of thoughts she had never quite articulated in person. She had been right, of course. The greatest treasure they had found was not the gold and silver from the scattered wreck, but the relationship they had built while seeking it, the partnership that had sustained them through decades of challenges and changes. Thomas lived several more years after Sarah's death, gradually weakening but remaining alert and engaged. He continued to mentor younger sailors, to share stories of his experiences, to provide advice and support to those who sought it. The Golden Light, now commanded by its third captain, continued to sail Caribbean waters, carrying cargo and occasionally treasure hunters who hoped to replicate the success of that legendary first voyage. On his last voyage, a short trip from Port Royal to Havana, undertaken more for nostalgia than necessity, Thomas stood at the rail watching the sun set over water that glowed gold with reflected light. He thought about that other golden light, the mysterious luminescence that had led them to the wreck, that had validated Costa's seemingly impossible story, that had launched them on an adventure that had shaped the rest of his life. Had it really glowed as he remembered? Was the memory accurate, or had he embellished it over decades of telling and retelling? He would never know for certain, but in the end it didn't matter. The story was true in the ways that mattered, in the courage it had taken to pursue an unlikely lead, in the partnership it had forged, in the lives it had changed, in the inspiration it had provided to others who dared to chase their own impossible dreams. The golden light had been real, whether as physical phenomenon or as metaphor for hope and possibility. It had illuminated a path forward when everything seemed uncertain, had revealed treasure both material and spiritual, had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible stories were true, that persistence and skill and, yes, luck could lead to discoveries that transformed ordinary lives into extraordinary adventures. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the tropical sky, Thomas felt at peace, grateful for the life he had lived, for the chances he had taken, for the people he had known and loved. The golden light had long since faded, but its glow remained, illuminating his memories, warming his final days, reminding him that he had lived fully, adventurously, meaningfully. And when he died, peacefully on that final voyage, his body was committed to the waters he had sailed for more than 50 years, joining the countless others who had sought treasure in the Caribbean, some successful, most not, all of them drawn by dreams of gold and adventure, by the eternal human hope that somewhere, just beyond the horizon, lay something extraordinary, waiting to be discovered. The story of the golden light continued, passed down through generations, embellished and simplified, transformed into legend, while retaining a core of truth. Thomas Blackwood and Sarah Merchant became figures of folklore, their real lives and complex personalities reduced to heroic archetypes, their careful planning and hard work overshadowed by the romantic elements of their story, the mysterious map, the dying sailor, the glowing water, the scattered treasure. But among those who knew the full story, among the descendants of the crew and the students of maritime history, the truth persisted, that treasure hunting was mostly disappointment, that success required not just luck but skill and judgment and trustworthy partners, that the greatest treasures were often not the gold you found, but the relationships you built and the lives you touched along the way. The golden light had been real, in all its ambiguous, contested, remembered glory, and for those who had followed it, for Thomas and Sarah and Miguel and all the others who had taken the chance and done the work and shared the rewards, it had illuminated not just a path to treasure, but a way of living, adventurously, courageously, generously, in partnership with others, always seeking but never losing sight of what really mattered. The treasure hunters of the 18th century were gone now, their bones scattered across Caribbean waters or buried in forgotten graves, their stories mostly lost or distorted beyond recognition. But the spirit they embodied, the willingness to pursue dreams, despite long odds, the courage to venture into unknown waters, the wisdom to appreciate success without being consumed by greed, that spirit persisted, inspiring new generations to follow their own golden lights, whatever forms those lights might take.